very, very hard to follow the great Al Shaler. I too want to just recognize the alumni who have gone out of their way to be here, especially those from my era. As I mentioned, Al Shaler, who was my first counselor, recruited me, was the first Batman at Forest Lake Camp, led the campfire for many, many, many years. Also the great Tiny Ferrara, who was from my era, and George Battle, back there, who is from a third-generation family, one of very few. Now, on to Phil. Phil always remembered the very first day he ever came to what became Forest Lake Camp. That was in 1925. He came up with his parents, came up the road, and he talked about remembering seeing a house with a birch bark canoe on a wooden porch. Now that house became what we know as the lodge. He remembered a barn that was across the way where hay was kept and farm equipment, and that barn has become the boys' wing of the mess hall. There were stables with horses, and those stables became what is now the craft shop and girls 4, 5, and annex. That same time, he and his parents, Harold and his mom, climbed a hill nearby, got to the top, and named that hill Lookout Mountain. They went down to a lake, which at the time was called Hutchins Pond, and renamed that lake Forest Lake. So 1 year later, in 1926, Phil became Forest Lake's very first camper at 8 years old. And he continued as a camper and a counselor through his growing up years, into college at Princeton, until he went into teaching in 1940. Now, an interesting story that his son Gary tells is related to the fact that Phil had a horse up here named Nicodemus. And at the time, in those years, there was a camp on the other side of the lake, called Spruce Mountain Camp, which was started after Forest Lake Camp. It was a co-ed camp. Now, it seems that during college, Phil had a particular interest in the daughter of the owner of the camp across the lake. Now, of course, it was absolutely strictly forbidden that any Forest Lake camper would set a foot on that camp. Although rumor had it that once in a while, to comply with the rule, there might be some little canoe rendezvous in the middle of the lake. Anyway, one particular day, Phil announced that he was going to take a little ride in the woods with his horse, Nicodemus, assuring everybody that, of course, he would never set a foot on Spruce Mountain property. Well, apparently he decided to tether Nicodemus to a clothesline instead of a tree. And about an hour later, Nicodemus showed up at Forest Lake Camp, dragging a clothesline with girls' bathing suits. No way to explain that one, Phil. So Phil's father, Harold, passed away in 1954, and Phil and Sally took over, directing the camp until Gary took over in 1986. Now, during those years, they operated as a real team, as Gary describes it. Phil continued to teach school in the off-season, and Sally ran the office from home. Phil used evenings and weekends to undertake his home visits, which were commonly done in those days. If a parent expressed interest in camp, one of the directors would go to visit that home, show some pictures, talk about the camp, and so forth. And it was really a first-rate team. Sally was capable of handling an enormous volume of work. Remember, there were no computers. And Phil was an earnest and convincing salesman. Enrollment was strong and at times excellent, as Gary has reported. During those years, from 1954 to 1986, 3 new cabins were built. one on the Vampire Mountain side of Cabin Girls 1, no longer there. It's now called Cabin 11 in the boys' camp. It was moved. And then boys' cabins 12 and 13 were also built. But the thing that Phil was most proud of during those years was the acquisition of the property on the other side of the lake where the girls' camp was, the co-ed camp was. He may have bought some memories, too, when he bought that property. It had come up for sale in the early 1980s, and Phil was concerned that it would be purchased by a developer, that houses might be built along that shore, who knows, maybe even condominiums, and the view from our beach and the beauty of the lake would be lost. So he borrowed some money, sealed the deal, and secured the beauty of our lake forever. One disappointment he did have was never being able to build an indoor pavilion. He had talked about it many times, but they were never able to have the funds available to make it happen. He would be very, very, very proud of what has happened this year and of this building. And very happy to see us all here dedicating happily and respectively this building to him and his family. So after retiring in 1986, Phil and Sally moved to Pennsylvania, where Phil died in January 2002 at age 83. Now, I personally had the privilege of visiting him 2 days before his death, and I was able to thank him on behalf of all the campers and counselors over the years for his nourishment of this place, for delivering to all of us our respect for the outdoors, establishing our values, and helping shape our lives. And I say again, thank you, Phil.